In this lecture, you will learn how to group form controls in a reactive form. We have already seen how to group form controls in a template-driven form. There, we group form controls in the HTML file. So there, we create a container element. Inside that container element, we put all the controls which we want to group together. And then on the container element, we use the form group directive. But in case of a reactive form, the grouping of form controls is done in the TypeScript class. Let's understand that with an example. But before that, let me show you how you can add a custom validation error message for a form control. So here, for this email form control, I want to add a custom validation error message. Let's go to VS Code, and here we are displaying this email form control. After that, let me add a div, and inside this div, let me create a span. On this span, let's set some CSS style. So basically, I want to set the font color to red. And then let's display a custom validation error message. And here, let's say the email you entered is not a valid email. Let's go to web page, and you will notice that that validation error message is being displayed here. Now, currently this error message is static. That means it will always get displayed, even if this form control is valid. But we only want to display this custom validation error message if this form control is not valid. So for that, first we will have to get access to this email form control, and on that email form control we have the valid property. So if that valid property is true, then we don't want to display this custom validation error message. But if that valid property is false, then we want to display this custom validation error message. Okay, so we need to get access to this email form control. And for that, what we can do is, so here we have this reactive form property. We are creating this property here. And what is it storing? It is storing a form group. So this reactive form property, which is of type form group, is going to have a get method. Okay, so here on this span element, let's first add ng if. Okay, then let's use this reactive form property, which is of type form group. And this property is going to have a get method. And to this get method, we can pass the form control name which we want to access. So for this email, the form control name is email, right? So let's pass that value to this get method. And in this way, we will have access to this email form control. Now this email form control is going to have a valid property. So if this valid property is true, we don't want to display this custom validation error message. But if it is false, then we want to display this custom validation error message. So here we also use this not operator before this expression. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page, and you will notice that initially this validation error message is being shown here because currently this email form control is invalid. But if I go ahead and enter some valid value in this form control, that custom validation error message is gone. Okay, so let me also open developer console here. Let's clear everything and let's click on this submit button. So when we are using this get method and when we are passing a form control name here, so in this case we are passing this email, it is going to return us. So here we have this controls property. Inside this controls we have this email property, and if you notice it is of type form control. So that get method is going to return us this form control, and this form control has a valid property which is currently set to true. Okay, so based on this valid property we are displaying or not displaying the custom validation error message. All right, now let's talk about how to group form controls together. So in this form, let's say I want to group this first name, last name and email form controls together. We can do that in 3 simple steps. The first step will be to move these 3 form controls, this first name, last name and email form control, in a container element. Okay, so for the container element, I'm going to create a new div, and inside that div, let's move this first name, last name and email control. So this is the first step. The second step is, on this div element, we need to use a directive called formGroup name. And to this, we need to assign a form group. So let's go to TypeScript class here. Now here we have a form group. So this reactive form is a form group. But this form group is storing all the form controls of our form. But what we want is, we want to create a form group which will have only first name, last name, and email controls. For that, to this object, the object which we are passing to this form group constructor, let's go ahead and let's create a new property and let's call it personal details. You can call this property anything. And to this, let's assign a new form group. And again, to the constructor of this form group, let's pass an object. And inside this object, let's specify the form controls which we want to group together. Here, we want to group this first name, last name, and email form controls together. So I will cut it from here and I will paste it inside this form group, this nested form group. Okay. And here, let's also use a comma. So this is the third step. And finally, let's go ahead and let's assign this personal details property to this form group name directive. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And here we have an error. And this error says cannot read property of null. That's because here we are trying to access this email form control. And here we are assuming that this email form control is present in this reactive form group. But if you notice, here we have moved this email form control to this personal details form group, right? It is no more a part of reactive form group. It is now a part of personal details form group. So this expression here is going to return null because it will not able to find this email form control on this form group. And on that null, we are trying to call this valid property. And that's why we have this error message cannot read properties of null. Now, instead of passing simply this email, we need to pass this personal details dot email. Okay, and this will resolve the issue. So if I save the changes, if I go to the web page, you will notice that that error is gone. So basically, instead of passing simply email, since this email is now a part of this personal details form group, we are passing personal details dot email. So if I submit this form, you will notice that this controls has this country, gender, and hobbies property, and it has this personal details property as well, which is of type form group. And if I expand this personal details property and then its controls, you will notice that we have this email property, which is of type form control. So if I expand this value property, so here we have this value property, you will notice that this email is now a part of personal details property, which is again of type object. So that's why we need to access this email on this personal details property. Okay, and you will also notice that this first name, last name, and email form controls are grouped together inside this personal details form group. So I can also show you that here. So you can see that country, gender, and hobbies are separate form controls. Then we have this personal details property, which is of type form group. And inside this form group, we have this email, first name, and last name form controls. So in this way, we can group form controls together in a reactive form. Now, before wrapping up this lecture, here if you notice this custom validation error message is being displayed initially when the page loads. So if I reload the page, you will notice that it is displaying this custom validation error message. Now, this validation error message will be gone if we enter a valid email address in this email control. Okay, so when the form control is valid, in that case, that custom validation error message is not being displayed. Now, what I also want is initially when the page loads, at that time also this custom validation error message should not be displayed. It should only be displayed if this form is invalid and if it is touched. So again, let's go to VS Code and let me move this validation error message in a separate line. And here, let's add one more condition. So for that, let's use this AND operator. And let me copy this expression, which is going to return us the email form control, right? So that email form control is also going to have a touched property. So if this touched property is true and the form is invalid, then only we want to display this custom validation error message. Okay. Now if I go to the web page, you will notice that initially that custom validation error message is not being displayed. But if I touch this form control and if I don't enter any valid value inside this form control, in that case, that validation error message will be displayed. This is all from this lecture. Thank you for listening and have a great day.